We thank all three of you for being here, but in particular, Mr. Kara-Murza, thank you for coming. And, we in American politics, oftentimes I'll hear a quote about something that's so politically courageous. Somebody took a politically courageous vote on this or that or the other. In America, the worst things that happens to you, if you do something, that doesn't work out well, you lose an election, you get a bad editorial, you lose your position because you lose an election, and you get to go work at a network as a paid analyst. That's the worst thing that happens to people here. In your case, and in the case of many like you that are standing up to that reality in Russia, people die. We had reports this week of an attorney, obviously very involved in human rights causes, who, according to some Russian authorities, fell, but according to most people that know about it, was pushed. Multiple stories, and is, I believe, in very critical condition. And obviously, it seems like every week now, somebody related to Russia, sometimes diplomats and sometimes often opponents of the Putin government, wind up dead, not exiled even, dead, and oftentimes abroad. We recently saw a report of that in Ukraine. So we have seen an incredible amount of reporting about public polling to the extent that it's accurate within Russia, and it shows that Vladimir Putin enjoys 80% approval ratings. My comment on that has always been, if I controlled the media in this country, I'd have 80% approval ratings too. But what was interesting to me about this weekend is that the age and the geographic diversity of the people that took to the streets, a very young population, younger Russians, and it's been theorized that the rationale for that is that many of young Russians, like young Americans, do not get their news and information from official organisms of the government. I think this is a good question for the whole panel, but rather are getting their news from mobile devices, online, and from non-traditional sources. In essence, because they're not getting their news from the Russian organisms, they're getting a broader perspective of the world. I ask that in the context of, I've always argued to my colleagues that one of the ways we have to understand Vladimir Putin's actions in the world is his domestic policies. His fundamental argument to the Russian people is, I am restoring Russia's greatness, but that is impossible without me. But look at us, we are now at the table once again on Syria, on all these other parts now, increasingly Libya apparently, and in other places. But that, for whatever reason, has not been enough for younger Russians. So I'd love to hear from all three of you about why it is that this weekend's protests were so unlike some of the protests we've seen in the past among much younger people. We also saw that video of students being confronted by a school principal, arguing with them about not joining these protests. What's happening with young Russians, and what can we do without undermining them? Because it appears that our engagement is often used against them. They are accused of being tools of a foreign agent. On the other hand, we can't stand silently by and silence our voices when we see oppression and people's dignity being violated. So what would you advise, and in particular with regards to younger Russians who apparently, at a minimum, don't want to be isolated from the world and are certainly concerned about corruption, but also the fact that there's a Russian presence in East Ukraine and an increased presence in Syria, which also has cost the lives of Russia's servicemen. So the question to all three of you, what can we do to strengthen civil society in Russia without undermining it through our engagement? And what's happening with younger Russians that explains what we saw this weekend?
Could I begin? Thank you, Senator Rubio. Thank you for the question. And if I could, on a personal note, thank you very much for your message that you recorded while I was in a coma. I missed it because I was in a coma, but when I woke up...
You see it after?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. My wife showed it me as I was still in hospital in Moscow, and thank you very much. I'm very grateful. It's very important, actually, to know that people know and pay attention, and thank you.
Thank you.
And your question is very, very important because I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was surprised by the scale of the protest and just the geography of it, but I wasn't really surprised about the demographics because over the past 3 years since we've relaunched Open Russia, and we've held many, many events around the country, public events, discussions, debates, roundtables, film screenings and such. And every time the authorities try to prevent and sabotage, and there's a fake bomb threat and the police arrives and whatnot, but every time people still come and they still attend and they refuse to leave and they're interested and they want to participate, and their self-awareness as citizens is becoming stronger than the fear. And this is a very hopeful sign, and it's mostly about the young people. And you're right, there are all these confrontations now in universities and schools and teachers and principals trying to say, why did you go out to these, demonstrations? How much did, the State Department pay you to go, and all this nonsense? And, and they answer back, they explain why. And it's very, very heartening to see and to hear that, because, again, this is the Putin generation, in quotation marks, of course. So this is a generation born and raised under him, and he's losing them. This is a generation that trusts Twitter and YouTube much more than they trust Russia 1 or any other state-controlled TV channels. They don't get their information, in fact, from Russia 1. They see that this regime is depriving them of the prospects. They see that, you know, Russia, thanks to the Putin regime, is becoming an international pariah, and they're not happy about it. They want the same things as their counterparts, you know, in other Eastern European countries, for example. And yeah, Mr. Putin likes to say he, you know, he made Russia great again and restored it to the table. I'm not sure what table he's talking about. For instance, it was because of his actions that Russia was suspended from the G8. I'm not sure that that's very good. You know, Boris Yeltsin, who was supposedly this was a period of humiliation, in quotation marks, if you believe the Kremlin propaganda. He got us into the G8, and Putin got us suspended. So which one is better? And you know, the fact that we're becoming a pariah for the whole world, I think that goes directly against Russian national interests. And as to your question of what can the world do, first of all, to pay attention and not to fall for Mr. Putin's line that Russia is only about him and about his regime and that there's nothing else. And this goes both for the positives and the negatives. So in terms of positives, to maintain lines of communications with other voices inside Russian society. Russia is so much bigger and so much more diverse than the Putin regime. And I'd be very interested, for instance, to see if the upcoming visit by the new Secretary of State will include meetings with, for instance, civil society representatives, alongside meetings with Kremlin officials. But also, and I think this is the most important thing, practice the principles that you preach. And this is why the Magnitsky Law was so important, because for years, many Russians, including those who oppose the Putin regime, have seen the West, you know, pay lip service, Western leaders pay lip service to human rights and other such issues, but happily welcome, for instance, the corrupt money the Putin oligarchs were hiding in, you know, in Britain and the US and other countries. And thankfully, this process is being reversed now with the Magnitsky Law and with other similar measures. It's very important to continue this. And the most important thing is just to stay faithful to the values and to the principles on which your systems are based. I think that's the most fundamental thing.
Of course, I agree with everything Vladimir said. I would just add that I think people have a visceral reaction to corruption. It gets at two things. It gets at issues of dignity, and it gets at the pocketbook. And it tends to bring people out on the streets, as this did. In terms of what we can do, I stand by what Vladimir said. I would just add that young people in Russia, in NDI's experience, like young people everywhere, are thirsty to learn and thirsty for interaction with their peers around the world. So anything that we can do to facilitate that kind of interaction, those kinds of exchanges, is helpful.
Just very briefly, Senator, I think the irony is we look at the question of how young people respond to the political debate in our part of Europe, so in the neighboring states. One of the most disturbing trends is that it is precisely among young people that radical leftist and radical rightist non-democratic parties are doing best. And I think that's a very disturbing trend that we will keep an eye on. We've just gotten some interesting polling data back in our Beacon project, just for example, that suggests that 58% of the population in Hungary today would prefer neutrality to their commitments under NATO or some sort of another relationship with Russia. And those numbers are even higher among young people. So it's an interesting sort of ironic division that we see evolving in the neighboring states.
Senator Coons.